The Large Hadron Supercollider. The Large Hadron Collider, LHC in Switzerland, built to study particle physics, is the world's largest machine and single most sophisticated scientific instrument. Because of this, and the cutting-edge research it's involved in, the LHC has prompted more than its share of fears from the general public. It has been blamed for causing earthquakes and pulling asteroids towards Earth. While conspiracy theories around the LHC have generally been disproven, it has also been accused of potentially creating black holes that could swallow Earth, a possibility that was curiously not completely discounted by the CERN, the organization running the collider. CERN claimed the LHC is not dangerous, but also acknowledged that some type of black hole could be created. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment. A government-funded study from 1932 to 1972 denied treatment for syphilis to 399 African American patients in rural Alabama, even as penicillin was found to be effective against the disease in 1947. The patients were actually not told they had syphilis, with doctors blaming their bad blood instead and given placebos. The goal of the experiment, carried out by the U.S. Public Health Service, was to study the natural progress of syphilis if left untreated. 28 of the people in the study died directly from syphilis, while 100 died from related complications. Project MKUltra. The infamous Project MKUltra was CIA's attempt at mastering mind control. The program started in the 1950s and lasted seemingly until 1966. Under MKUltra, often unwilling subjects were given drugs, especially hallucinogenics like LSD. The people tested were also put through sleep and sensory deprivation, hypnosis, sexual abuse, and other kinds of psychological torture, while some tests proved lethal. The supposed goal of the project was some combination of chemical weapons research and effort to create mind-controlling drugs to combat the Soviets. Kola Super Deep Borehole. A Soviet experiment started in 1970 sought to drill as deeply as possible into the crust of the planet. By 1994, they bore a 12-kilometer deep hole into the Kola Peninsula in Russia's far northwest. The record dig provided much scientific data, like the finding of ancient microscopic plankton fossils from 24 species. While nothing negative happened, there were concerns at the time that drilling so deep towards the center of Earth might produce unexpected seismic effects. Like cracking the planet open, the hole's site is currently closed. Guatemalan STD Study. This horrid experiment is another instance of the U.S. government causing harm in the pursuit of science. From 1945 until 1956, around 1,500 Guatemalans were deliberately infected with sexually transmitted diseases, including syphilis and gonorrhea. The subjects included orphans, prisoners, prostitutes, and military conscripts. Researchers used disease-infected prostitutes, injections, and other unscrupulous methods to make their subjects sick. Subjects of the experiment are currently suing Johns Hopkins University for $1 billion for its role in the study. The Aversion Project. A medical torture program was instituted in South Africa between 1971 and 1989 to cure homosexuality in military conscripts. The policy, carried out under apartheid, included forced aversion therapy treatments like electric shock therapy and chemical castration. The Army also authorized as many as 900 sex change operations. It was widely believed in the medical community at the time that homosexuality was a mental illness that could be cured. Dr. Aubrey Levin, in charge of the program as chief psychiatrist of the South African military, was eventually accused of human rights abuse by international organizations and received a prison sentence. Unit 731. Unit 731 was a secretive R&D unit of the Japanese Army that carried out horrendous experiments on humans during World War II. Commanded by General Shiro Ishii, the unit experimented on an estimated 250,000 men, women, and children. Most of the victims were Chinese, along with some prisoners of war from Russia and the Allies. The forced medical procedures involved vivisections, cutting open subjects usually without anesthesia, unnecessary limb amputations, and removal of body organs like parts of brain, liver, lung, and others. Victims were also subjected to biological warfare, frostbite testing, forced pregnancies, and even weapons testing by grenades or flamethrowers. Radiation experiments. Radiation was a hot topic during the 1940s and 1950s, and understandably so. Scientists at the time had plenty of reasons to learn precisely how dangerous radiation was to the human body. But it's difficult to justify the lengths they went to, because their experiments involved a lot of human experimentation and little consent. There are several different examples of this, the 1945 Vanderbilt nutrition study, for instance, in which hundreds of pregnant women were, without their knowledge, given drugs with traces of radioactive iron. And there was an experiment conducted around the same time in which school children were fed radioactive calcium, fully backed by the US government. Perhaps the most egregious, though, were the plutonium injection experiments. And the name tells you most of what you need to know, as researchers wanted to see how radioactive materials were absorbed by the human body. Around 30 supposedly terminally ill patients were unknowingly injected with radioactive plutonium, in some cases at doses far above the lethal limit, or with plutonium isotopes that were known to be especially radioactive. Records of these injections were kept secret very intentionally, to avoid the expected public outcry and off of normal hospital charts. Consent was only given in, at best, one of those cases, and, to make the situation even more twisted, at least a handful of those patients weren't even terminally ill. One was a 2-year-old child who died less than a year after being injected. Operation Midnight Climax. In 1955, you could easily find an unassuming little house in San Francisco, tucked away on Chestnut Street. Outwardly, there wasn't much you could say about it, but if you started to pull away the curtains, you'd find something much more sinister. This was actually the site of a CIA experiment, one called Operation Midnight Climax. To be technical about things, Midnight Climax was just one part of MK-Ultra, the CIA's wide-reaching experimentation surrounding mind control. But it was awful enough to build up a notoriety all its own. Specifically, it was meant to focus on a particular fascination with LSD, but the execution was hardly scientific. Sex workers were hired to lure unsuspecting victims to the house, and once there, these victims became unwitting subjects, dosed with LSD. Meanwhile, behind the two-way mirror, those in charge of the experiment would just sit and watch, all while apparently having a pretty good time. The ethics behind this are obviously questionable for many reasons, but it gets even worse. George White, the man who was officially in charge, had intentions rather divorced from drug research, voyeurism. Sure, there were discussions of how to use sex to extract information and the like, but White clearly had more self-serving interests in mind. The Trinity Test. It's hard not to put the world's first nuclear test on such a list. In the mad rush to develop the atomic bomb and gain a military advantage in World War II, America instituted the secretive Manhattan Project. This resulted in the Trinity Test, a detonation of the first ever nuclear weapon in a New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945. While the scientists were relatively confident in their work, there were some famous doubters who wondered if the bomb would even explode, or if it would perhaps cause the end of the world as we know it. Waiting for the bomb to go off, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Enrico Fermi wagered others whether the bomb would just destroy New Mexico or the world, potentially setting the Earth's atmosphere ablaze.